With these videos, we're aiming to create an online library where if you don't manage to come to Full Circle or any of our events that we think are worth putting up, you can come in your own time and look at this video and learn about the topic.
Good morning. I'm Priscilla Daniel. I'm one of the traders at the Wakefield, and I'm pleased to facilitate this third presentation of the day held by Tom Cumberlege, who is an associate director at the Carbon Trust working on value chain analysis and strategy. He has an extensive experience helping business to understand their climate change risk and opportunities, working across a diverse range of sectors. Dear Wakefield, we just started to assess our carbon footprint with the goal to reduce it at the corporate and supply chain level with the support of Carbon Trust and Tom. This is why we wanted and we are privileged to have Tom today to share with you what is carbon footprint, how to assess and set targets and reduce them. So I will, just before Tom starts, please, during the presentation, if you have any question, write them on the chat. I will collect them and I will ask them to Tom after the end of the presentation. Thanks again, Tom, for being here today, and I'll let you start the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Priscilla, and thank you very much for inviting me along to your Full Circle event. I'm pleased to help present the topic that you outlined today, which is carbon footprinting. So I've just shared my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. Can you just let me know if you can see the slides okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yes,
Cheers.
all good.
Perfect, good, excellent. That's the first hurdle done. Second thing is to apologise. It's a background picture there is actually of tea growers. I couldn't find something for coffee, but just a small note there. So in terms of the agenda, as Priscilla introduced, my name's Tom Cumberlege. I'm an associate director at the Carbon Trust. I've been with the Carbon Trust for just over 12 years. And in terms of the agenda for today, I've got half an hour just to give you an overview of these topics that I have on the screen. So in terms of the agenda, I'll just give you a quick introduction to who the Carbon Trust are, if you're not familiar with us, then set the scene really, set some of the context behind carbon footprinting, or the need for that in the context of climate change and the very real threat that we're facing from global heating, the efforts that are being taken globally to address that and to reduce emissions, and then bring us back to some of the context that Priscilla's outlined, which is, what is a carbon footprint? How do you go about measuring it? What is the different terminologies involved? How can you get started on this route if you haven't already? And then consider the types of targets that organizations are setting, predominantly referencing the science-based targets, and then finally just wrap up with some of the strategies and that organizations are setting to develop carbon reduction strategies, essentially. So that's what I'll cover off. As Priscilla mentioned, please do make use of the chat facility to put in your questions there as I go through. I'm really happy to spend some time at the end just running through questions, no matter what they are. So don't be shy, put those questions in, and we can hopefully have a good discussion towards the end of the presentation. So in terms of introduction and who the Carbon Trust are, so Carbon Trust is an emission-driven organisation, essentially not-for-profit. Our mission is that we will help to transition the world to a low-carbon economy. We want to accelerate that transition, and we do that by working with businesses, with governments, organisations around the world to help them understand what their carbon emissions are now, and help them understand how they can reduce those and overall achieve greater resource efficiency. So we, as I mentioned, we work with businesses, governments and multilateral development banks and organizations around the world to help them understand those impacts and transition. So our main office is based in London, but we have offices, as you can see on the map there, around the world. And the team's made up of a whole range of different disciplines, from environmental sciences, climate change science, engineering, management consultancy, and those different disciplines, I think, is probably quite important when you're thinking about the challenge of climate change within businesses as well, because you need, on the one hand, you need the obviously the environmental background, the ability to collate data, to pull together an understanding of what reductions can be done from an engineering perspective. But ultimately, you need to make the business case for this sort of investment as well. So it's important to have mindful of the fact that when you're looking at developing climate change strategies, it's both a technical specialism that you need, and also the sort of change management and presentation of the business case as well, to encourage the need for investment on this. So we have a range of different disciplines involved, and over 20 years of supporting organisations. In terms of the different activities we provide policy advice. Just if you join the call, if you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute, so it doesn't disturb the rest of us, that'd be great. I'll carry on, and hopefully that message will get through, or someone can mute the person. Great, I think that's just been done. Brilliant. So what we do then is we provide a policy advice to governments, to businesses. We provide specific corporate advisory services around footprinting of organizations, of their products, developing reduction strategies. We have a team looking at technology innovation. So we work with governments to develop technology innovation and investment programs. We also provide assurance and certification of organizations or products that have been measured appropriately, are making reductions and are aligned to a low carbon economy. Also, lots of work we do on program design and management with public sector organizations, as well as a team looking at green finance and this increasing shift by the investment community to align investment to sustainable outcomes as well. So a team looking at that. In terms of experience then with corporates, a whole range of different corporates and different sectors that we've worked with over the years. 75% of the FTSE 100 we've been working with, and lots of organizations in the food and drink, agricultural sector, food and manufacturing, transportation and logistics of products, as you can see on the screen, a whole different range of activities here. And I think that's really important when we think about reducing carbon emissions from business activity, because obviously business activity spans many different sectors of the economy, as we'll start to look at when we look at the coffee value chain later on in this presentation. Okay, so giving you some context then, having introduced who the Carbon Trust are, around the challenge that climate change is presenting us all. So the challenge we have is that on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see here CO2 emissions by world. And effectively, all I wanted to show is a significant increase in acceleration of carbon emissions globally. And when you look at the cumulative impact of CO2 in the atmosphere today, the majority of that impact has occurred within the last 40 years, despite emissions occurring and picking up pace much longer before that. And then on the right-hand side, what we see here is the temperature anomalies. So this is the increase above average temperature that we see year on year. And you can see the clear correlation between, on this chart on the left-hand side, 1950 to more recent times here, 2000. So 1950 to 2000, that clear correlation between increase in global warming gases, there's predominantly CO2 here shown, and the increase in global temperature. And why is that a big problem? Well, you hardly need to ask too far, because it's already on our news today. The very significant impact that the increased heat in our atmosphere is having on extreme weather, disrupting our lives, our economies, insurance payouts, the environment generally. So this snapshot, screenshot on the left, you won't be able to see it, but I've included it here. And the slides, by the way, I've made them available to DI Wakefield, so you can send a request for a PDF for these as well, so you can look at them in more detail if you want to pick out any information. But this is quite a good, well, sobering report from the World Meteorological Organization. They publish every year a report called The State of the Global Climate. And this is inside the cover page, just the highlights of that report, and just picked out a few significant things. So the challenge we have is actually, global average temperatures have reached 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial level era. And the knock-on effects of that, we have increased ocean heat, melting of the ice sheets, giving rise to sea level rise. We have extreme heat occurring inside the Arctic Circle, which is hugely abnormal, leading to significant wildfires, not just obviously inside of Siberia rather, but also in California and Australia, most significantly over the last few years. Also, the opposite end, you have extensive heavy rain, flooding in parts of Africa and Asia, drought in South America, and increased heat in our oceans and our atmosphere, giving rise to more severe storms. So, the urgency to act, given how close we are to our goals of trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, is significantly apparent, and this year above all others, because when you track back to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which was initiated back in 2015, we've seen a whole range of initiatives spring up since then. So I mentioned again, this World Meteorological Organization report. So, looking at 2020 was one of the 3 warmest years on record. The warmest 6 years have occurred since 2020, or this past 6 years, including 2022, have been the 6 warmest years on record. So this year in November, we've got the UN conference occurring in Glasgow as an effort to try and increase the ambition of economies around the world to reduce those emissions. From a business perspective, we have a whole range of initiatives springing up from the investment, pensions, insurance community to really look at the climate change risk that is inherent in certain sectors of the economy, and to ask businesses to disclose the risks and opportunities that they face in terms of financial terms going forward. So we see a significant shift in investor interest in this topic, and the flow of finance towards renewables, towards lower carbon solutions all over occurring. And the challenge we have, as I said, this 1.5 degree goal, which is inherent within the Paris Climate Change Agreement, we see since Paris in 2015, we've seen a whole bunch of businesses signing up to commitments to reduce their emissions. What does that mean essentially? It requires some significant carbon reduction in terms of decarbonising emissions, and ultimately trying to get towards that goal of net zero emissions by the second half of this century, by 2050. So that's some of the context. Originally the Paris Agreement, national commitments, and then increasingly a number of businesses setting those commitments, which I'll come on to in the next section. But before I go too far, just wanted to reflect back on these terminologies around carbon footprinting, because some of you might be at an earlier stage in terms of understanding what is a carbon footprint and so on. So I'll just set some of that context and the importance, firstly, in measuring emissions. So measurement is the most crucial step. You can't manage what you don't measure, is the age-old adage that's often quoted. And it's so important. So from our perspective, this is sort of representing good carbon management, essentially. So the first step is always to measure, gathering data, predominantly starting off with your energy data and converting that into greenhouse gas emissions is the first step, which I'll be talking about in the next few slides. And then following on from that, it's around setting targets. So understanding from that carbon footprint, understanding what the broad dimensions are. So where are the significant hotspots? Where does it make sense to maybe undertake an energy audit or to look at opportunities to reduce that carbon footprint, and ultimately look at setting targets. Those might be ambitious targets like the Science Based Targets Initiative, and aligning yourself to that global goal. And then the next step from that is obviously then implementing energy efficiency measures, looking at renewable energy investments, and getting on that pathway to doing that. And then finally, it's that circular approach of then reporting on progress towards those targets, and then going through the cycle again and continually keeping track of your emissions, reporting on them and disclosing them. So it's becoming an increasing trend for businesses to disclose their carbon emissions and their efforts to manage them over time. So why are they doing this? So I've mentioned many of these already, but there's a range of different drivers there, both internal drivers to reduce costs. Obviously, if you're using less energy, you're spending less on that operational cost. You're maybe using less materials, wasting less, which obviously all have a carbon impact. So, identifying areas for opportunities to reduce costs is a key driver as to why you might want to look at carbon footprinting. Managing future risk as well is a key theme. So as I mentioned, the investment community, I mentioned a number of governments setting in more increasing ambitions that will eventually come out as increased regulatory burden and legislation to encourage businesses. So if you're already measuring, you're getting ahead of the curve, essentially, from those ability to comply with carbon footprinting. And then finally, this factor around influencing. So not only being able to sort of communicate how you as an organization is taking responsibility, is playing your part to reduce emissions, but also communicating that to your customer base as well. So being able to communicate to your customers, whether that's B2B environment or it was a B2C environment with consumers, to be able to communicate to consumers that your business is indeed aligned to similar low carbon goals, is investing in products and services and supply chains that are also aligning to those goals as well. So whole reasons there as to why carbon footprinting is important, and it's really important to clearly articulate that at the start of any footprinting project to really understand, well, what is it that you want to measure, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that in the next few slides. So firstly, I've mentioned carbon footprinting quite liberally so far in this presentation. So what is it if you're confused? So effectively, a carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gas emissions caused either directly or indirectly by an individual, organization, event, or even a product. So it can be expressed in different ways. And effectively, we refer to carbon all the time, but essentially what do we mean by that? It's a range of different greenhouse gases that have a global warming potential on the atmosphere. So often the number that you can see, well, the carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e, is the reference unit that we use to communicate a carbon footprint. So carbon is one of the greenhouse gases, as you can see there on the left-hand side, carbon dioxide. You can see my cursor. Carbon dioxide is one of them, but you also have a range of other greenhouse gases that have a global warming impact. So methane being 28 times the impact of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide being 265 times, and then all the way through to a range of other greenhouse gases such as hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride, all of which have global warming potentials which are significantly higher. Hydrofluorocarbons having global warming potential of up to 7,500 times the impact of carbon dioxide from, and these are typically occurring hydrofluorocarbons in refrigerant gases. So if you have air conditioning units, it's worth understanding, what type of refrigerant gas do you have in those? And from your facilities management team, how often do you need to top them up from that perspective as well? So that's the basics of, what is a carbon footprint? It's a total expression of greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you go about calculating it? So it's quite straightforward. There's two key bits of information you need, essentially. One is the volume of the input, which we typically refer to as the activity data. So this might be kilowatt hours of electricity or gas you're consuming, or it might be the fuel you're using in your vehicles, diesel, liters of diesel or petrol, or indeed, the kilometers you're transporting your products. essentially what you need to do is to multiply this data by an emissions factor. So there's carbon dioxide equivalent emissions factors for kilowatt hours, litres, and so on, in order to work out what the total carbon emissions are. So this is perhaps shown more clearly on this next slide. So as I mentioned, you're looking at understanding what the source of emissions would be, electricity, diesel being some of the most common sources. You're gathering the activity data, in this case, electricity, 10 kilowatt hours, or 10 litres of diesel, as the example shown here. You're then finding the emissions factor. Now, these are really important because you need to find the right emissions factor for the activity data that you're reporting against. So in this case, we've got an emissions factor of 0.26 kilograms of CO2e per kilowatt hour. So you use that emissions factor, you use your activity data in order to work out what the carbon footprint of your electricity would be. And then consequently, you look at adding up all those different sources of emissions to get towards your overall carbon footprint. And you can do that over typically, an annual basis, an annual carbon footprint disclosure. But obviously, you might want to do that on a monthly basis to track data throughout the year. And I've just included here, as by way of examples, some links here on the screen. So here's a UK government source of emissions factors that you can source to do this calculation. And also Carbon Trust has a small carbon calculator on our website. So quite straightforward. If you've got good data on your electricity, diesel, or core sources of energy, you can use the calculator on our website to calculate your carbon footprint. It's got an online calculator to do some of that for you there. So that's understanding how you calculate a carbon footprint. So briefly, I mentioned different types of carbon footprint at the start. You can look at an organizational carbon footprint. This would be typically, within the four walls of your organization. So whether you have an operating from an office environment, or whether you have a roasting facility or packaging facility, you might just be accounting for the emissions from the building's energy use, industrial processes, or if you have any company vehicles, you would account for that there. That's referred to as scope 1 and scope 2. I'll just come back to that terminology of the different scopes shortly, but at this stage, just to bear in mind, there's these organizational footprint, which is typically your reporting company's impact from energy. You then have the value chain footprint, which is typically everything upstream of the organization. So the supply chain, taking into account the embodied carbon within ingredients, so coffee in your cases, or packaging, or transportation, logistics, all the way through to the use phase and end of life. So what happens at the end of life for the packaging? Or is there a carbon impact for the use of coffee as well, or any complementary products that might be used to enjoy the coffee? So you can account for all of that across the value chain. And that's really important because it then gives you the holistic view of where the impacts lie across your business activity, not just within your organization. Now, there's also other products, other footprinting boundaries you can define. So a product footprint, this might just be, just purely looking at the carbon footprint for a per serving, per coffee serving, might be an espresso or a latte, or it could be per kg of coffee transported to a port, or it could be the carbon product footprint of the packaging unit. So you can look at product footprints as well, or as you see, the list goes on. Event footprinting. Obviously, we're all dialing in online today, so we haven't had to fly huge distances or travel. But you look at event footprinting when we were having events, or you can look at indeed personal lifestyle footprinting as well. There's a number of calculators online. If you're curious about your own personal carbon footprint, you can use these online calculators to look at that information as well. So DR Wakefield is looking at the organizational and value chain footprint. So what we refer to as scope 1 and 2 and scope 3, which is shown on this next slide. So just to unpack this a bit, the reporting company in the middle, scope 1 emissions, these relate to emissions that are directly released into the atmosphere through the operation of these assets. So that might be combustion of natural gas in roasting facilities, or it might be fuel used in company cars. You're effectively releasing that directly into the atmosphere. Scope 2 being the energy that you're using in these facilities, but the impact is indirect. So it's occurring in a power station typically for electricity that you're using in your assets. You're accounting for that within your scope 1 and scope 2. And that's coming back to it. That's your basic organizational footprint. And then you have everything, including scope 3 emissions from a whole range of items here, from purchased goods and services, the embodied emissions with coffee, with packaging, through to transportation, storage in warehouses of those products, through to business travel, employee commuting, all the way through to categories such as use of sold products, end of life treatment, if a company has any investments and so on. And the purpose for this is really to help organizations understand, well, where is the material impact? Where does us as an organization, where do we need to influence those emissions? And the definitions I've just provided you again at the bottom of the screen there are shown there for your future reference if you want to look at these slides at a later date. So those categories are important. So here we have some examples of different sectors of the economy. So we have the operational emissions, the upstream shown in dark blue and the downstream shown in light blue. You can see the different sectors of the economy. Obviously, the importance is to look in different directions. So from home appliances, where the impact is very much in the use phase, maybe washing machines or fridges. So all the electricity used in those white goods and appliances in homes, through to meat processing, where there's a big impact from livestock taking place on farm, which is in the supply chain, and the processing of that is very small, and the use phase is also very small. Coffee is somewhere actually in the middle, having some impacts from cultivation, and then also obviously from the use phase, and some impact obviously from processing and so on, which is effectively shown on this next slide. So from that question around activity data and what activity data you need to collect, it depends really on where you are on that value chain process. So if you're a processor, you obviously want to collect information on your roasting facility, grinding facility, fuel, electricity consumption. If you're wanting to look beyond your own four walls, then you might be looking at, well, what's the carbon footprint associated with the coffee we're purchasing? How is it being transported, distributed to us? Can you get data on that? Or do you need to look at secondary data, which might simply be how far has it traveled, what mode of transport, and how much has been transported during the year? Use phase, again, all sorts of details you can go into, but predominantly that's being based on assumptions and some quite variable assumptions, as I think we'll see on the next slide. And then end of life, again, some information on packaging and end of life fate of that packaging, whether it's going to be recycled or not. So here's another slide I just put out from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and quite interesting, looking at the different carbon footprint of different coffee types and different scenarios. So the top one here, you can see milk from a latte, obviously having a really significant impact from the embodied emissions with milk and on-farm emissions from cows, from enteric fermentation, manure management, etc., all the way through to espresso in instant coffee, where the balance is somewhat bit more balanced between the emissions associated with cultivation of those beans from fertilizer application, mechanical sources from diesel, from tractors and so on, to collect those on farm, through to in the middle bit, the transportation, packaging pieces having somewhat less of an impact as well. So key thing here is that there's assumptions that go into this. So depending on what assumptions you use for use phase can vary enormously, depending on how much milk you might need, how much water you boil, where you boil it in the world, depending on what the grid factor is, etc., etc. So huge variation. But the importance really is to to understand, well, where do you sit on this value chain piece? What's your area of influence? And then if you're looking more broadly, what's the impact in supply chain, and what efforts can you go to in terms of engaging with the suppliers to deliver reductions? So here's an example, not coffee, I'm afraid, but this is beer, showing you the overall breakdown, in this case for Carlsberg Beer Group. They have a range of different activities across their value chain. So they source hops, they then have malting facilities, they have brewing facilities, they have a range of different packaging formats, from aluminium cans to glass bottles. They distribute that globally, and they refrigerate it in bars, and pubs and so on. The biggest impact for them is in packaging. So they've set targets, they've set ambitious targets to reduce 0% carbon emissions. They're going together towards zero, and they're going together predominantly because they need collaboration across their supply chain and their value chain to achieve that. So they're going off and they're working with their packaging suppliers predominantly to work out how they can get lower carbon aluminium for their cans, looking at the design of their bottles to lightweight them, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole range of initiatives would spring out from this in terms of understanding that. But the crucial first thing, as it comes back to, is measurement. Getting that measurement in place so you can understand where those impacts lie and where your influence can play a part, and where you're needing that collaboration with partners. So this stage here, just to remind ourselves, different types of footprinting. I've been talking about organizational and value chain. Just to quickly cover off value chain footprinting, you can look at measuring the impact of specific products to different boundaries, whether that's to cradle to product manufacturing gate or all the way through to cradle to grave, which looks at the disposal of end-of-life treatment. And there's international standards for that as well. So some key international standards to use. And we've developed our own label for this, so as you can see on this next slide. So we've developed mechanisms for measurement, for helping organizations manage, reduce, and then ultimately certify and communicate the fact that they've gone through this process and achieved some goals to recognize their own chain of custody and of that of their suppliers, and made some efforts to reduce as well. And then you can see use of the label on different brands here on the screen. I won't dwell on that too long. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'll just wrap up quickly by covering something on targets. So I mentioned earlier around the Paris Agreement and the importance of setting targets. So lots of organizations are stepping up to the ambition around the climate change agreement in Paris. So since that's signed in 2015, we've had over 1,500 very large corporates sign up to setting a science-based target. Now, essentially, that's aligning their goals with what you can see on the bottom green lines here, which is the 1.5 trajectory. So this is a carbon budget whereby we need to drastically reduce our carbon emissions to align ourselves with that goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. These businesses are setting themselves up to reduce their emissions in line with that. So there's an organization called Science Based Targets Initiative. There's a whole range of criteria that they require organizations to complete to disclose their emissions, to disclose their targets. The key thing here is that if scope 3, and you remember this is a supply chain, if scope 3 exceeds 40% of the total value chain, then they also need to set a target for those emissions. So what we see occurring is large retailers, large branded good companies setting these targets and asking their suppliers to go with them on that journey to reduce their emissions as well. So just to sum up this section on targets and just to clarify some of these terminology that's being bandied around now in terms of net zero and science-based targets, SBTs here. A science-based target is essentially a steep decarbonisation target. So this is reducing your absolute emissions from your operations, from your supply chains, from your logistics, etc., in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. That's looking at this trajectory. And organizations are setting those to different timeframes, some having very ambitious 2030 goals, others around 2040, 2045, etc. And essentially they're setting these goals and understanding and beginning that collaboration to understand what can they do from their own operations, what can they do to reduce their supply chain operations as well. And then they're taking that ultimate goal, which is looking at the long-term goal to balance residual emissions with removals. And that's essentially what we mean by net zero. Net zero is that balance between reducing as far as you can along the trajectory of a science-based target, so reducing, and then when you get to the point where actually, some of the agricultural emissions or emissions just cannot be reduced any further from a technical perspective, then it's shifting to look at buying removal offsets. So these are offsets that are typically taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing them away permanently. And that's essentially what the carbon net zero goal is about. It's around reducing as fast as you can, and then ultimately moving towards removal offsets. The other thing you may have noticed here is optional compensation, these dark grey bit That's effectively what we mean by carbon neutrality. Essentially, you're buying into projects in other parts of the world which will compensate your own emissions, but it does not reduce or remove emissions out of the atmosphere. It's basically making a compensatory effect by investing in renewable energy somewhere else in the world, or avoiding deforestation and so on. Hopefully that's clear. So feasibility, just in the last few minutes, I'll wrap up. So the typical process is, again, measurement, getting that measurement in place for your own operations, deciding on how ambitious you want to be, whether you want to look at product footprinting or the impact of your supply chain as well. The important thing when you're looking at targets and the feasibility of targets is to factor in, well, what's your business strategy generally? If you just look at your core business strategy, maybe to sell more products, you need to bear that in mind, that you have a growth scenario here potentially as well. And then you need to obviously look at, well, what reduction initiatives can you have? Might be, roastery from heat exchangers, looking at alternative sources of fuel to renewable sources, or electricity, using renewable electricity and so on. And ultimately looking at this feasibility assessment. So understanding where you need to get to, maybe if you're setting a science-based target, what the sum total of these reduction efforts would be. And this is where the technical assessment comes in, either through energy audits or for engaging other supply chain organizations or organizations within your group to understand what that gap might be to your target. That's the final piece there. And then finally, just to sum up, if we're going to get towards net zero as a whole, you're going to need some pretty drastic, fast, short-term action, as well as medium and longer-term goals as well to work towards. So, I've just divided this into different themes you can see on the vertical axis, and then different timeframes along the horizontal axis, just to give you a flavour for types of things. So we've worked with a drinks manufacturer, and this is an example of the type of roadmap they've developed off the back of the project that we've done with them. So the first thing they want to do is they want to set themselves as science-based targets for their own operations, and also consider that for their value chain as well. They want to commit in a long-term goal towards net zero, but they want to make that commitment now. In the medium term, they want to look at the prospects for renewables in their value chain. They want to develop some significantly ambitious targets for recycling. For implementation, they want to conduct these energy audits. So they want to start commissioning these audits, understand where those reductions can take place from their own sites. They want to engage with their suppliers. And medium term, look at procurement guidelines, how they can look at low carbon procurement as service providers, and the long term goal towards net zero. So looking at those removal offsets in the longer term. They're also considering, well, what are the risks to their supply chain from a climate change perspective, from those extreme weather events that I've mentioned at the start of the presentation. How will that impact their business to operate? As well as looking at innovation, so innovation in material designs for their products, packaging, looking at organic raw materials with lower carbon footprints. And indeed, you're looking at, from a packaging and bottling perspective, looking at take-back services. So, avoiding the need for creating new packaging and getting that take-back loop into consideration as well. And the final point here is recognizing that as a brand, they have that influence with consumers. They've got some communication space on their bottles, so they can communicate, what's the key action that consumers can do to reduce the carbon impact of the product that they purchase. Is it reducing, reusing the bottle, or is it recycling it? Is it specific cooking or preparation instructions to reduce the carbon footprint during the use phase? So hopefully that sums up, what is a carbon footprint? Some of the climate change objectives that corporates and businesses are setting themselves in terms of the real challenges around climate change globally. How do you calculate that? Types of methodologies for looking at developing a reduction strategy, and this final phase here in terms of recognizing that we do need short-term ambitious action, but you need to sort of start to categorize that in terms of different work streams, different areas of climate change activity. And to start to consider resourcing that across different teams in your businesses. So I'll pause there. I think we've got some time, hopefully last 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so for questions. And I think, Priscilla, I'll pass back to you.
Yes.
I'll stop my show.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. It was really exhaustive and fascinating presentation. We could go for days. Actually, I think it's a broad topic. I suggest actually we all move to the breakout room. Then we can take the opportunity to ask all the questions in the breakout room. So yes, so see you in a bit.